Actually, the topic today is more recent book on the Exodus and Egyptian story, which just came out in November, because it's in the research that I was doing for that book that I became aware of Amelia Edwards and her own personal interest in the Exodus. Mostly what people talk about her is the Egyptian Exploration Fund, but she had this other interest, as you'll see in this talk. So let me go ahead and give you the abstract that I submitted for this. Amelia Edwards was the driving force behind the creation in 1882 of the Egyptian Exploration Fund. Now, as some of you may have heard, the Egyptian Exploration Society. And her story is a remarkable one. She was a woman from no money and no formal training in Egyptology, who had spent decades of her life in totally unrelated activities to this last decade in her life. She died in 1892, 10 years after the creation of this fund. And yet she became well known and an expert in this. Along with her determination to promote Egyptology was her desire to find the root of the Exodus, and this is often overlooked. She had written extensively about the Exodus and was certain she knew who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. The first archaeology campaign by the EEF, so right away in the 1880s, was to find the root of the Exodus, and they thought they had succeeded. Now we need to put her in a little bit of context. When she first started writing, Amarna tablets had not been discovered, Merneptah stele had not been discovered, and the site of Avaris was not known as the Hyksos capital and later for the 19th dynasty. So this makes it interesting to read her, how passionate and strong she was in her views based on the knowledge information at that time. And you wonder a little, suppose she had lived to see some of these other discoveries, how that might have affected her. But as important as the Exodus was at the dawn of Egyptology, just as the Bible was as the dawn of Assyriology, the biblical influence was soon eclipsed by solely Egyptian concerns, and the Exodus vanished from Egyptology, which is where this lecture will end up. So I'd like to examine a little bit of the life of Amelia Edwards and see how things changed with her. So there she is, known as the Queen of Egyptology, and I will show you that article later. This picture that you see of her is towards the end of her life. In 1890, she came on a tour of the United States. And during that tour, she gave, I've seen different numbers, 115 to 120 lectures. Now, imagine doing that today. I don't think anybody does that outside maybe of music groups and singers. And even that would be a lot. Even with all the emphasis on King Tut for next year, I doubt any one person is going to give that many talks. So this shows you a huge logistical effort, since it was being made in the United States for a speaker from England, without, of course, the internet, and yet they arranged this. And it should be noted, and I'll come to this again, that her own background in theater and opera undoubtedly aided her in being able to speak this often during this tour. Mainly it was here in the Northeast, the I-95 circuit. Well, there was no RC, there was an AIA, and to colleges and museums. And while she was here, she noticed that women in the United States seemed to have more freedom than they did in the UK. But unfortunately, she fell towards the end of this tour. She troopered on, finished it, and then fell twice more.
Oh my God.
she never really fully recovered. And, she died in 1892. And now my screen, okay, there it is. And I want to emphasize that point about the women for a minute, go into her scholarship. She wrote in a book, which I'll show you shortly, about Hatshepsut, as she pronounced it, Hatshepsut, has been happily described as the Queen Elizabeth, which is a contemporary reference of Egyptian history. And she was undoubtedly one of the most extraordinary women of the ancient East. She proved herself to be the most magnificent builder sovereign of Egypt. And I think you can start to see in these references that she's looking to see how a woman can succeed in a man's world. She was doing that in her own life now in the 1880s. And she was naturally drawn to an Egyptian ruler who she thought had done the same. It was to the genius and energy of this extraordinary woman that Egypt owed that great work of canalization, which first united the Nile and the Red Sea. Now, that was a big topic of discussion in the 1880s, perhaps more so than it is today, because their first excavations would be in the Wadi Tumilit, which I'll come to. And that also ties in with the Exodus, meaning where the water at the time of Ramses and Moses. How far north did the Red Sea extend? What were the connections with the Wadi? She saw Hatshepsut as an ancestress. Now we have to remember the Suez Canal had only opened in 1869. So that's just a few years ago. She saw that happen. She knew about its importance. So again, she's looking at Hatshepsut as succeeding in the man's world as she would now. She went back and rewrote her earlier book to give Hatshepsut more credit as she learned about her in the 1880s to revise her 1877 book. And she saw Hatshepsut with her exploration to Punt, in some ways like Napoleon, where she had scientists, so to speak, collecting the flora and fauna of Punt and bringing it back to Egypt. So this was a big important theme for her. Now, I'm not going to go over all her pre-Egyptology life. You can see some of that here: reading, theater, writing, music, performing, so on. So if you looked at this, except for that first book she devoured as a child, you would never say that she would become the queen of Egyptology in the latter decade of her life. There's nothing in this earlier part of her life that would really lead you to that conclusion. So according to this one biographer of her, in 1871, meaning after her parents died, after she had not established a career for herself in any of those professions that you saw in the previous slide, and she was not married, so she was kind of at loose ends. And this biographer writes, the remedy for whatever was oppressing her was to go abroad. And in the event of the travels of the next 2 years were to be crucial. Through them, she achieved the distinction she had sought from girlhood, though not in a way she could have anticipated, which is certainly true. So her first big venture was into northern Italy. It was a terra incognita at that time as well, not really built for tourism. So it was an adventure for her to go there. And she wrote her own travel book about it, which started her on to her next one, which would be about Egypt. So this was in 1873. And then later that year of the publication, she decided to go on a walking tour of France. It didn't work out because it rained a lot. So she said, oh, let's go to Egypt instead. So it's just by chance, in effect, that she ended up there back at this time period. Makes you wonder what would have happened if it had good weather. So for her, we need to see this as what's called a physical and psychological adventure. It was important for her on a personal level. Though she went there in 1873, the book itself was not published until 1877. So what was she doing in the interim? Excuse me. No, this is where she started to become an Egyptologist. She became an Egyptologist, and the research she did to make this more than just a travel book, but almost a history of Egypt as well. So when you read this book, you really felt like you were there in Egypt and you understood what you were looking at. Now, the research was conducted partially in person from the people she met in Egypt, like Maspero, and partly by letter, actually a lot by letter. As she followed up on questions she had, she read journals, what there were. This goes to the heart of the question that was a criticism of her, that she was not a formally trained Egyptologist. And that's true. She was not a formally trained Egyptologist.
Shadow, where'd it go?
Could you please mute the sound? Thank you. What would it take to be a professionally trained Egyptologist in 1877? And the answer is there was no way to become one. There weren't graduate schools and Egyptology classes.
Nice boy.
There weren't really formal training programs of any kind. You learned a little by doing, in her case, going to Egypt, almost like an apprentice system where you pick the brains of the people who were already doing Egyptology. So to say that she wasn't a formally trained Egyptologist really isn't a fair point, because there was no formal mechanism in 1870s where you could become a formally trained Egyptologist. She herself would be the one who endowed a chair in Egyptology at the University College in London that was held by Sir Flinders Petrie. And she picked that school because that college accepted female students, and why she didn't do it at some of the other choices. So this was just beginning. And what I want to turn to right now is how Egyptology began to develop as a profession. If you read this book, you see how she's drawing on her artistic background. She wrote, "It's all so picturesque." And she used that word 34 times in this book to describe the landscape, the scenes that she was seeing. Indeed, so biblical, because this is other part that was important to her, that she was stepping back in time, so to speak, to looking at the world the way it was in the time of the Bible. And biblical archaeologists in Palestine would have the exact same reaction for decades, that you're actually stepping back into the past. So poetical. And here's part that's interesting, given a lot of the discussion that's going on today, that these places are not just beautiful backgrounds, and that people are not just merely appropriate figures, so the European travelers could sketch them, but they're real people. And we see that in some of the discussions today with Egyptology about how it's focused on the past and not quite accepting the people in the present as real people. They're just sort of there blocking the view of the ancient times. Now, how was she able to do this? Well, a couple of changes had occurred, both in which you know. In 1798, Napoleon going there, sort of putting Egypt back on the European map. So it wasn't just a place for the isolated traveler, the intrepid traveler on their own. And then on the right, the invention of the steamship less than a decade later. which would revolutionize travel not only to Egypt, but travel in Egypt on the Nile. When you traveled to Egypt, it was a pretty basic route that you would go. And it was pretty standard for everybody. Not like flying to the United States from England, let's say. You land in New York, and then there's so many different places you could go to. In England, when you traveled to Egypt, this was it. You arrived in Alexandria, you headed down to the Second Cataract, you made a U-turn so you could see Abu Simbel the way the Nubians would sailing downstream. And then you, on your return voyage, you would stop at these great sites like the pyramids and the Sphinx there. So this was the standard route for everybody. And what was missing in this is, and what was missing in archaeology, is a lot of the delta itself, the so-called land of Goshen in the northeast corner. No one was really excavating there. You didn't have these big monuments like you see here. And no one was really traveling there because there wasn't much to see. So you just sort of went from Alexandria to Cairo and then went upstream, did the U-turn and came back. Now I want to put Egyptology in context there so we see what she was working against. One of the changes that affected first biblical studies and then later Egyptology was the development of geology as a science in the 1830s. Why was this important? Because this raised doubts about the 4004 BCE date Bishop Ussher calculated for the origin of the universe and the creation story in the Garden of Eden. So I don't want to go into the biblical side, except to say that when Egyptologists began debating the date of Menes, or now Narmer, they were very aware of that 4004 limit and tried not to go back to, in some cases, 5000 BCE and other dates like that. So this became a form of attack on the validity of the opening chapters in the book of Genesis, that they could not be taken literally, and perhaps they had not been written by Moses. Another change that occurred in the next decade, in the 1840s, was Assyriology with Austin Henry Layard, you see here, with these two cherubim that he was bringing back to England. Now, in effect, Assyriology was a couple decades ahead of Egyptology. We need to realize these words didn't exist. Egyptology didn't exist even as a word until the 1850s. They also both would suffer from the problem of the British Museum. The British Museum considered Greece to be the ultimate in human artistic expression. And the Elgin marbles are not that much earlier than this, that is being brought to the museum. So there was no real place, so to speak, first for Assyriology and then for Egyptology, for their art objects that they were bringing back. So as I say, they both went through this process, but Assyriology was doing it 20, 30 years before Egyptology went through that. You see here also that they reached out to the public, Nineveh and its remains. And this was because a lot of these archaeological discoveries had the names of people who were mentioned in the Bible: Assyrian kings, Israelite kings, Judean kings, Moabite kings. And that was the way Layard could sort of circumvent the British regime and get general public support by highlighting these biblical connections. Another important discovery in this process was in 1872, when at the British Museum, George Smith discovered tablet 11 that you see there of the Gilgamesh epic, which had a flood story. A flood story that was very similar to the biblical account of Noah. And this is part of the era that's a little different from what we have today, where archaeology was thought of as a way of proving the Bible to be true. that what you were finding in Assyriology and what you would find in Egyptology would substantiate the biblical story. And the same issue that the Bible was facing, the Iliad, the other great narrative, so to speak, from the ancient world, was also experiencing, that it really wasn't true. It was a made-up story. And then, of course, Schliemann discovers Mycenae, and you say, well, actually, the site of Troy does exist. So this all in the 1870s was showing archaeology can help you prove the ancient narratives that are being attacked by the new sciences like geology, and being attacked in biblical studies. In 1882, the same year that the fund was discovered, there was an opening at the professorship of Hebrew in Oxford due to the death of the current holder. Two lead candidates here, the one on the right who got the job was more receptive to the high criticism coming out of Germany that said the Bible really wasn't written as the 5 books of Moses. There were other ways to understand those stories. Whereas the candidate on the left who lost, Archibald Sayce, was a strong defender of the historicity of the biblical accounts. He would become one of the founding members of the Egyptian Exploration Fund. And he would be a strong advocate for the work that he was doing. So he was never hired by them to excavate for them, but he was a member, and he was supportive of that work in its connection to substantiating the biblical account. Here's where Egyptology began to liberate itself, if I can use that term, from classical studies and become a discipline in its own right. If you were formally educated in ancient studies, what did that mean at the time that Amelia Edwards was self-taught in Egyptology? It meant you learned Greece, Rome, and the Bible. So if you knew Egypt through them, through the Bible with Joseph and the Exodus, and through the Greek studies, Herodotus, Alexander, and then Caesar in Rome. And the epitome of that was George Rawlinson here, who translated Herodotus. And I have this same edition myself, same cover, slightly beat up as well, that he did, that he translated. Now, why is he important? He's important because he then wrote a book on the history of Egypt. And Amelia Edwards wrote a book review on it in August 6, 1881, in a semi-popular publication called The Academy. And she's extremely critical of this expert, as you'll see in some of these quotations here. He's very knowledgeable, has read a great many books, knows a lot. But look at the last line. I think maybe you can see my cursor. He has left unread full 3/4 of literature of his subject. So for all his knowledge in the classics, in Greece and Rome, evidenced by his translation of Herodotus, he wasn't really an expert on Egypt. And the self-taught Amelia Edwards was going to put him in his place. So she turns to this chapter on religion, and not too subtle here, absolutely unacquainted with nearly every new light which has been thrown upon the subject within the last 7 years. In effect, she's saying he's out of his league. He may be great as a Greek scholar, but he's not an Egyptologist compared to her. And nowhere does Canon Rawlinson's defective equipment, that's a pretty harsh term, portray itself more unfortunately than in his biographies of the gods. We have rarely met an author who is so little in love with his subject. And one final one. To go on multiplying instances of this kind would be a useless and ungrateful office. That's pretty harsh. That's really harsh. He's a distinguished Greek scholar, so he has encyclopedic knowledge. But here you see in the bold, but the time is past when Greek scholarship was a sufficient qualification for the task he has undertaken. So this is almost like a passing of the torch from the old way of learning about Egypt that Rawlinson represented to the new way of learning about Egypt that Amelia Edwards represented in her own research and her own studies before it really emerged as a formal discipline in the academic arena. So she began writing about topics in Egypt, especially related to the Exodus. So here's a letter in the Academy in 1880. So it's this column, whoops. It's 3 columns, 1, 2.5 columns here. And it's great that I can look this up from home online and download these and read these, but this is really small print. It would have been small print to read back then in 1880, but she's starting to investigate Ramses and the Exodus. Now we have the announcement in 1882. The Egypt Exploration Fund is now in existence. They issue this press release. Now look at the names in red who you see highlighted as founders. Archbishop of Canterbury, a bishop, the chief rabbi, a deacon. Now, when you think of an archaeological society, are these the professions that come to mind? And the answer, quite obviously, is no. You would expect people like Layard and Sayce, who I previously mentioned, but you wouldn't necessarily expect these religious people. So what is their involvement in this? Why are they participating in the founding of this new, somewhat academic-related organization? And here's its purpose, or one of its main purposes. It was also concerned about preservation of Egyptian monuments. But as the press release says here, and I'm sure she contributed to the writing of it, they're looking to document a lost period of Bible history. And what is this lost period? Well, they know what the land of Goshen is, which is a biblical term where the people sojourned before the Exodus. And then you see in red, 4 centuries of the Hebrew sojourn in Egypt. What happened? It's glossed over in the biblical account. She writes almost blank. So the goal of this society, right from the onset, is to fill in these missing 400 years by focusing on the land of Goshen where they lived. That was its task. That's why it had the kinds of members it did who were from the religious side of the arena. So how is she going to do this? She writes a popular version too. It's down here at the very bottom of this new publication called Knowledge, Bringing Knowledge. There's this little itty bitty note here, which I wrote on the right, announcing that there will be an important series of papers by someone who's an author and an Egyptologist, and it will be about Ramses. And now we're getting ready. The next issue, another announcement. In the next volume will appear the most interesting series of papers by Edwards. She knows who the pharaoh is in the middle down here, of oppression is. Part of the reason why that may have happened is in 1881, the mummy of Ramses II was found. And we know that because we have the identification was found with his mummy. That made it really easy to detect, to identify him. So then just a few months later, she started a 16-part series, which I am not going to go through, from June 2nd to January 19th, about Ramses as the Pharaoh of oppression. Now, one of the articles, or somewhere where I was reading about her, the author thought that these 16 parts may have been extracted and put into a pamphlet, but the author didn't know if that was true or not. I don't know either if it's true. But you certainly could take that 16-part series, and you saw how small the print was, and put that into a booklet about this is Exodus scholarship in the 1880s. This is what people believed about the Exodus. So she covered the 400-year period, starting with Joseph, going through to the Hyksos ruler of Apophis as a part of the effort to fill this story. This was a common idea that Joseph served under the Hyksos ruler of Apophis as one Semitic person who could serve a non-Egyptian pharaoh. There was a lot of debate about the ethnicity of the Hyksos and the Apophis. That's not the topic here, but he was not an Egyptian ethnically. So that was a typical starting point for Joseph. And I'm not going to read the section on the left, but I'm just going to point out, you can screen save it if you want, that she's dealing with the land of Goshen from the biblical title. She's going to be focusing on the Wadi Tumilat, which is the one main path that you could take to leave Egypt or to enter Egypt. And that would be the first area where the excavations would be authorized by the newly created EEF. And that's exactly what happened. Now, at the same time, a few months later that year, this new book came out by one of our colleagues from the British Museum who helped her create this new organization, the EEF, called the Cities of Egypt, which she thought should be called really the Cities of the Bible. And she wrote that. And in her book review, which is a lot more favorable than the one on Rawlinson a few years earlier, she says, remember the enthusiasm excited by the discovery of the Chaldean deluge tablets. So she's referring to that Gilgamesh epic flood story that I showed you a few slides ago. And she's drawing on the fact that that was like front page news. Prime Minister Gladstone had been in attendance when George Smith revealed the contents of that flood story. So this was a major development back then. And she says, one asked with wonder how that enthusiasm is compatible with the indifference to the far more momentous discoveries which await the Egyptian explorer. So she had great expectations for what could be found by these EEF excavations in the Wadi, and said they were vitally more important than all the deluge legends recently collected from every corner of the globe. So here were people collecting flood stories from everywhere, but they're not looking at, so to speak, the flood story, the one from the Exodus. And now she's authorizing an excavation to that very location. And this is why that previous mentioning of the canals and the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of the Red Sea, rather, and with the connections became so important. She's really challenging the people. Wake up, Protestants. Wake up, the Bible-loving church, the chapel-going English people. Stop sleeping. Get serious. So this is a fundraising letter, but kind of strong language. You need to help us. Here is one possible way that they thought about as a fundraiser. In his book, Poole had celebrated or thought he had found the very walls on which the enslaved Hebrews worked. He said, this is where they were. This is where all those stories about the bricks and the building were really happening. And it's a step towards finding out the route of the Exodus. And they even considered, this is kind of funny in a way, that they could sell these bricks, these mud bricks, as a fundraiser. And then they realized how big they were and said it's probably not very practical to send these mud bricks back to England for sale. But I don't doubt that if those rooms with these walls had been more habitable, they probably would have rented it out. So you could say, hey, I slept in the room built by the slaves from the Bible. So after these excavations by the EEF, naturally a book came out, The Store City of Pithom and the Route of the Exodus in 1885. And it contained this map here showing the route. And you could see they're very concerned about the waterways. So here's the Suez. How far north? Oh, sorry, whoops. Gotta go back. How far north did these waters extend? What canals? And you can see freshwater canal, ancient canal, Pithom. How far did these waterways extend? Did these canals extend? And how could we use that? Ancient shore of the Red Sea. See, that's written here on the side. So there was a big debate about how far the Red Sea extended north, how close it was to these waters from here, and what that might mean for the story of the Exodus. But there's one thing she kind of overlooked here, and it happened with Schliemann as well. Suppose you find Mycenae. Does that mean you found Achilles? Does that mean you found the battle of Achilles and Hector and the dialogue of Achilles? Well, no, it just means you found Troy, a city where it could occur. And the same is true that she never really accepted with the Exodus. So you have the Wadi, you have these water flows, you have these canals. That doesn't prove the existence of Moses. It doesn't prove that the people were there. It just proves that these places that are mentioned are real. And okay, that counts for something, but it doesn't bring the story really to life. And it's ironic because she's a storyteller. She wrote novels, so she knows about that. But she never really wrote a story of the Exodus based on the archaeology. After she returned from the United States, she had one last book in her before she died, Pharaohs, Fellahs, and Explorers. And I really give credit to her for the way she wrote this book. When she describes a mound that she's looking at, you would think she's talking about a living person. That's the way, that's her language. I can't quote it here because it's too extensive to put on the screen. But as an example of her language, just consider this sentence. He, meaning the Egyptologist, must not only go up the Nile, he must ascend the great river of time and trace the stream of history to its source. Don't you love that language? Try using that though in a grad paper, in a seminar, or to an article you submit to an academic journal. But this is where she's bringing her non-Egyptological background, her art background, her theater background, her poetry background to bear on her writing. These wrecks, meaning the ruins of Upper Egypt, are noble ruins open to the cloudless sky and touched with the gold of dawn and the crimson of sunset. not standard academic writing. But she also says, on a slightly more serious note, a flood of unexpected light has been cast upon the biblical history of the Hebrews. So now she's claimed we're being able to fill in that 430-year period to mark out the actual route of the Exodus. And this is what the EEF was all about during those first 10 years. When she died in 1892, here is an obituary written here in the United States, and she's referred to as the Queen of Egyptology. And the author was the honorary secretary for the American chapter of the EEF, which actually started to raise more money for the EEF than the British chapter did. And it may well be because of that biblical connection. Miss Edwards knew Egypt personally and its story completely. She mastered the literature of research and exploration. Nay, was she not born to be an Egyptologist? She knew the whole field of Egyptology better than any man, which he meant as high praise, and she probably would have thought of that as high praise. I pray for her, but I never expect to see another Edwards in the domain of Egyptology. The queenly title is hers. So this shows you how she had established herself in that decade. So what is her legacy? Well, on the left, you see now the Egypt Exploration Society. New name. It's going strong. I think it's even republishing one of her books now and collecting funding for that. But the other part of her legacy, her interest in the Exodus, not so well. And here's this quotation I'm going to give you on the right side. With the work of these early Egyptologists, the search for the biblical cities associated with the Exodus was on. But it seemed that Alan Gardner's strong condemnation of those who we might call biblical Egyptologists, and he does that in the 1920s. And he does that in some articles in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, which is what the Egyptian Exploration Society began to publish. Continues to cast a pall over serious investigation of biblical history with the aid of Egyptology. Since the 1930s, there have been only a few Egyptologists who've integrated their work with biblical studies in particular, as it relates to the Exodus tradition. Now, James Hoffmeyer has done that. Excuse me again. He is a biblical Egyptologist. He is an evangelical Christian. And he writes about the Exodus, and he excavates in that area as well. But he's pointing out that regardless of her own personal interest, Amelia Edwards and others in the 1880s, for this area of research, it died out completely. So that part of her legacy has fallen away. The society still exists and is still active and preserving monuments and so on. But her own personal interest and of those, many of her colleagues, that has fallen away. So her legacy is very positive in one side and kind of disappeared in the other. And with that, I think I will conclude my talk and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Peter, very much. Appreciate it. Fascinating discussion. I certainly wasn't aware of a lot of that. So we do have a few questions. So let me bring them out here. Let's see. Someone's pointing out Mycenae is not the same as Troy. Dana is doing that.
Right. What I was getting at is with these archaeological discoveries, and Schliemann worked at both locations. He worked in Greece and in Anatolia, was finding physical proof that these places existed. And therefore, oh, did I have a slide of Mycenae in the Lion Gate and not Troy? That's what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes, okay, you're right. But he did excavate at Troy as well. And the point was that these two places are real, and therefore the Iliad should be given credit as an historical narrative.
Okay, and I have a question for you. Some of the things that you had, like the newspaper articles, et cetera, where on earth did you find those?
Well, when I started doing the research, in a real book mentioned Amelia Edwards. And it mentioned her sort of in passing, and it cited 2 or 3 of those 16 articles. I didn't know there were 16 when I read that, but I went to look at it. I went to look up the journal. Now, the advantage you have online now is you can do that from home. This from the Columbia Library. You just go online, I look up that journal, find the ones that were mentioned, and then I just had to do a search in the index or look at subsequent issues, and eventually discover that there were really 16 in a series about the Exodus. Plus, she had written some other things which I didn't mention here as well. And when you do that, you can download that right to your home computer and print it, because it's really hard to read online. I much rather read it when I'm holding it.
Okay, we have another question. Someone would like to know what part of Egypt the Exodus actually took place in.
What
part of
what?
Egypt the Exodus actually took place in?
Oh, I recognize that name from someone who just heard my last lecture at the Greenberg Library and wants to know when that tape's going to be available. Well, it's pretty well known, more so than in her point, with the discovery of Avaris, that the Hyksos in the 19th dynasty are really are known for sure. We know where the Hyksos ruled. We know where the 19th dynasty ruled. We know the 19th dynasty linked itself to the Hyksos in the 400-year stele, commemorating the Hyksos arrival into Egypt. So if you're going there, you only have 2 main choices. You can leave from there and go along the coast in what's known as the Way of Horus in the Egyptian record, and the way to the land of the Philistines in the biblical record, or I-95, as I call it. So that's the road you're going to avoid, because that's where all the troops are located. You're going to go through the Wadi. Those are the only 2 choices you really have if you're leaving from there. You know, if you're in Thebes or in Aswan, it's a different story. But if you're in the Delta and you're in the city of Ramses and you're in Avaris, those are your only 2 choices on how to get out. So the Wadi is a reasonable choice on how to do it. But as I was saying, just because it's there and it has canals doesn't prove that Moses had led people out of it. Just means if he did, that's the route he would take.
Okay. Edith Goldman would like a link to the book. And Edith, if you have an iPhone, it is available on the Apple bookstore. I've just checked it myself, and it's definitely there. You can download it.
The book is called The Exodus, an Egyptian Story. I chose not to include that slide here because this is not a lecture on the Exodus. It's on the EEF and its attitude towards the Exodus.
Just for clarity, the reference I was making was to 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. That's the link on the.
Oh, but the new book that came out in November, The Exodus and Egypt Story, which has Amelia Edwards in it, as I learned about her, I included her. She's in chapter 1. That book is available on Amazon and elsewhere. It's published by Oxbow.
Can I ask a question live?
Sure, go ahead.
It's Dana. I got in just a little bit late. I don't know if you mentioned that beautiful copy of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, because I've been getting emails from, you must too, from, who is it in England? The Egypt Society or whatever it is over there. They're collecting funds to reissue that book or in its original form.
Right, I think I just mentioned, Dana mentioned that in passing.
You did?
That
didn't
I
miss
thought
that
they
part.
were, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I
So
think
I
it would
say
be
her legacy lives on.
be
And
nice
that
to have a
book is a
copy of that
testament to her
book.
legacy. But
Yeah.
her interest in the Exodus, not so much.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. The 19th dynasty connects itself with the Hyksos in such ways as the importance given to Seti and Seth. Do you think there may be a physical or genetic relationship as well?
Between the 19th dynasty?
And the 15th, I would assume the question is referring
Well,
to.
there's speculation. There's speculation that you have the Hyksos, they're chariot warriors. The family of Seti, going back to his father, Ramses I, and his grandfather, also named Seti, they're all chariot officers too. So you're all in the military together. The term Egyptologists use now, or who write about the Hyksos, is hybrid. They describe Avaris as a hybrid demographically, a mixture of peoples, of intermarriage. So given that they're there for 400 years, at some point, was there an intermarriage going back multiple ancestors? Yes, but you could speculate. That's all it is. There's no way to know at this point. But it's certainly possible. And I guess if you were making a movie, you could always include that in there, showing that Moses and Ramses really are relatives going back to distant ancestors.
Okay, another question. We often hear about famous male archaeologists like Carter and Lawrence of Arabia. How much did Edwards influence the era, such as in fashion, art, stories, neo-ancient movements, Egyptian influences, etc.?
Well, her biggest influence was really creating this organization and then popularizing it, like going on that tour to the United States. She was not an archaeologist herself. She traveled there, she visited sites, she wanted to preserve monuments, but she was not excavating any of them herself. But she was popularizing it and she was supporting it through this organization. So she's not like Carter in that regard. But I will say in 1882, since you mentioned Lawrence of Arabia, it's also the year England took over running Egypt. So while we're talking about all these things in an academic context, we need to realize politically, England was now in control of Egypt. We need to remember that it's only 20 years earlier with Speke and Burton and his discovering of the source of the Nile. And we need to remember also that by the 1890s, shortly after she died, for the first time in human history, one political authority would control the entire Nile, from Lake Victoria, Lake Albert, all the way up to the Mediterranean. It's the first time that had happened. So while these archaeology things are going on and Egyptology things are going on, politically, England was getting very involved in that area, economically as well, because after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, our Civil War, England lost its source of cotton from the Confederacy. So where did it get cotton? Egypt. And it began to develop ways to, how can you have 2 crops in a year? How can we have more floods? How can we control the floods to produce the cotton production for our textile factories here in England? So England was involved in many ways with Egypt at this very time that she created the Exploration Fund, beyond the archaeology, politically, economically, geographically, so on.
Okay, and then the question has come up, and I know this is a popular question. In the literature, what time period was the Exodus? And I've heard a few answers to this question, but curious what you think.
Well, you see from Amelia Edwards, she's very definitely in the time of Ramses. So it's the same as Cecil B. DeMille, and the most popular time is, and the time I take in my book, the Exodus, an Egyptian story, is the time of Ramses. So that would be in the 13th century BCE.
Okay, let's see. An interesting question. Manetho has a different perspective on the Hyksos, that they oppressed the peoples of Egypt and treated them as a lower class. Does this not conflict with your perspective that the Hyksos saw themselves as part of rather than apart from?
Well, I didn't go too much into the scholarship of Amelia Edwards herself. In the book, I mentioned what she writes about the Hyksos, which is similar to what Manetho thought about them as well. If you look at the 1880s and through most of the 1900s, the image of the Hyksos is very negative. If you look at the image of the Hyksos more recently, since Manfred Bitek's excavations at Avaris, and more has been known about the Hyksos, you have a completely different image. And the way I approach it in the book is separate the 18th dynasty image from the 19th dynasty image. The 18th dynasty was very negative on the Hyksos, very derogatory, puts them down. The 19th dynasty is based in the Hyksos capital and celebrates their arrivals in Egypt and has a totally different view of them. Egyptologists have tended to adopt the 18th dynasty view and the Manetho view. I adopt the 19th dynasty view. And I think that's becoming more and more prevalent because the evidence speaks for itself now that it's been excavated.
Okay, and I think that's the last of the questions that I have. So once again, thank you so much for your talk tonight. I really appreciate it. It's very thought-provoking. And I think I speak for everybody in saying it was a great talk and we really enjoyed it. So thank you
very much. And thank you for this opportunity. And thank you all for, I can't say coming out on this night the way you would if it was an in-person lecture, but thank you for at least connecting on the internet.
Okay, thanks everyone.